Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to learn how to focus our sentences by finding the heart of the sentence. I'm going to start with a story. Once upon a time, many years ago, I was teaching my ninth graders about subjects and predicates. As I so often do, I started by asking, who remembers what these words mean? What is the subject of a sentence? And as so often happens, silence. Most of the class averted their eyes downward, avoiding eye contact. The more clever ones were pretending to look through their notes for this answer. But one student sat with her chin tilted up, her eyes in the same direction, clearly actually thinking about the question. She slowly raised her hand and said, "I think the subject is like the protagonist of the sentence." I paused, looked at her, took a deep breath. "Yes," I said slowly, still processing. "Yes, that is an incredible answer. Did the rest of you hear that? Write that down." The subject is the protagonist of the sentence, the main character, the person or thing whom we are supposed to be totally invested in, even if it's only for the span of one sentence. Why had I never heard it explained this way before? And why was I finding this comparison so powerful? While I'm still not sure about the first question, the second one is pretty obvious. It's because story matters. Story matters. Story is how we first begin to understand the world around us when we're very young. At first, we learn life lessons through children's literature. Then, books teach us more about the world and ourselves. Our parents might tell us stories about their own lives to serve as inspiration or warnings. When we try to explain something to another person, we usually use a narrative structure to do this. The next time you ask someone what happened or what's wrong, listen with presence, and then go back and notice how they answered. Chances are they told you a story with a main character, a bad guy, a conflict, and maybe even a resolution. We process our lives through story. Story is at the heart of living. So yeah, story matters. So what does this have to do with sentence structure? If we process the events in our lives through story, then we can also zoom in to the sentence level and see the elements of story there. For a story to make sense, it must have a main character and a conflict. A person has to do something. For a sentence to make sense, it must have a subject and a verb, a person who does something. Who or what we choose to be the subject of the sentence will have significant impact on how our readers understand the sentence. The most important part of writing for a reader is for the writer to choose a clear sentence focus. To make this choice, we writers must figure out what the heart of the sentence ought to be and then try to make that the subject. Who or what is most important for readers to focus on? Just as you don't make the person who experiences the central conflict a side character in the story, you don't hide the true subject inside some other part of the sentence. Let's try it. Here is a sentence that's somewhat confusing. A first, though not the last, just released from juvenile detention, a gang member for most of his life, whose first stop was not to his family home but to our school. Now, we obviously don't have any context, which is why looking at sentences in isolation will only get us so far, but it's a good place to start. Without worrying too much about what this whole sentence means, find the heart of the sentence. Who is the protagonist, and what is the protagonist doing? Part of the difficulty with this sentence is that it's actually not one. It's not a complete sentence. The heart of this sentence is the young man being described, but neither the word he nor his name appears in the sentence. Without a clear subject, something or someone to focus on, readers are confused. When teachers write frag in the margins of your paper, we're communicating, albeit not very effectively, that the sentence confused us by not meeting that most basic reader need, someone or something to focus on. Throughout these lessons, I will be using the word guidelines instead of rule. The word rule can be triggering for some people, but more importantly, to me anyway, is that rules imply immovability. It's fixed. And that's not how writing works. The rules have been created so that we can communicate with each other. Without that basic set of conventions, chaos would abound. But we teachers often overemphasize the rules to the point that we turn students off of writing, which is the opposite of what most of us actually want to do. So instead, we're going to talk about guidelines, conventions, and reader expectations. And once you learn what these are, you can play with those conventions and expectations to achieve powerful rhetorical effects. But you've got to master the basics first. And the first, most basic guideline for clear sentences is this. Whenever possible, choose specific concrete nouns or clear personal pronouns for your subjects. Avoid vague, abstract nouns, unclear pronouns, and complicated phrases or clauses. Let's return to the previous example. A first, though not the last, just released from juvenile detention, a gang member for most of his life, whose first stop was not to his family home but to our school. What specific concrete noun does the sentence need? We need the name of the boy. Now, we don't have the name in the sentence, but if we were the writers of this piece, we would probably know the name, or we'd have to create it if this were a work of fiction. So for the sake of time, we're just going to choose a name. Let's call him Matt. So why did we choose Matt as the subject of our sentence? That word doesn't even appear in the draft. This is because of the second sentence focus guideline. Whenever possible, the subject you are writing about ought to be the grammatical subject of the sentence. In other words, the protagonist of your writing piece will very often be the subject of your sentence. Don't worry about sentence variety right now. This actually doesn't create sentence variety issues, but we're going to look at that in a future lesson. So what other options do we have? What other nouns are in the sentence? The other options are gang member and first stop. So these aren't the heart of the story. This is not what my story is about. This is kind of information about our protagonist. So I probably don't want to make these the heart of my sentence, unless, of course, I've already developed that heart and I'm trying to create a sentence that's only description. But again, for the sake of time and clarity, we're going to assume that is not our purpose at the moment. The other information, though, is pretty interesting. And we are going to bring that information in, but we're going to do it through modifiers. Matt is the person the sentence is about, so he needs to be the subject of the sentence. The next essential component of a clear, complete sentence is the verb. And while we will write millions of sentences in which not much happens, we should strive to choose vivid action verbs whenever possible. Why? Because our sentence protagonist needs to do something. You are certainly allowed to describe subjects using linking verbs, but keep those sentence types to a minimum, and we'll get more into linking verbs in another lesson. So what is the main action in our sentence? The verbs that are here now are released, which is actually a passive voice verb. Again, topic for a future lesson. And then was, which in this case is functioning as, it's not really describing an action. Let's keep it at that for now. But the emphasis, based on the fact that we have this protagonist and what we want to see is what he's doing, it needs to be on him coming to the school first. That seems to be what matters in this sentence. So let's choose a verb that expresses this. Some options include came, arrived, entered, stopped, visited. I like entered. So our sentence core is Matt entered. The rest of the information will be placed around this core to provide the other essential information in a clearer way. Matt entered is our sentence core, but it's not very exciting. Our original sentence had some really juicy details that we don't want to leave out, so we need to add them back in as modifiers. It's kind of like the frosting of a sentence, and I don't know about you, but frosting is kind of my favorite part of the cupcake, and I don't eat cupcakes without frosting. Modifiers are the groups of words that describe the subjects and verbs in the sentence. This is why a clear sentence must start with a clear subject and a verb. Otherwise, the modifiers are there, but we don't know what they're doing. Where we place the modifiers will depend on the larger context in which the sentence lives. Usually, though, we have three options. We can place the modifier before the word being described, after the word being described, or somewhere in the middle of a sentence. Logic will usually dictate these choices, but for the most part, modifiers should be placed as close as possible to the words they modify to reduce the possibility of further reader confusion. So, which parts of our sentence describe Matt? Just released from juvenile detention and a gang member for most of his life. Which parts of our sentence describe entered? The piece of this sentence that describes entered, or the way that he's entering, even though the word entered isn't there, is this part, this last clause. So I might do something like this, knowing that Matt entered is the core of my sentence. What I've done is taking the information about Matt and made it an introductory modifier. I could put that information between Matt and entered, but I don't really like the way it interrupts those two things. I don't like the rhythm of it, and I feel like it might lead to slightly more reader confusion at this point. So this is the way I like it for now. However, this decision would ultimately depend on the context of the whole and what is both clearest and most rhythmic based on the surrounding sentences. So that was easy, right? It's kind of hard at first, but it does get much easier with practice. We've just looked at a sentence that is probably from a narrative, or at least a narrative scene that's part of another genre of writing. The good news is that these sentence-focused guidelines apply to all genres of writing, because having a clear subject and verb is the most basic reader need, kind of like how our most basic human need is for clean air. The better news, maybe, is that we will be looking at how to choose a clear sentence focus in a variety of genres, because we want to really master this skill regardless of what we're writing. And while the essence of it is the same, the focal points shift a little bit. So if we really want to strengthen our ability to choose a clear sentence focus, we need to look at it in a variety of contexts. But we're going to do that another day. So let's just, before we finish, do a little guided practice. Here is a sentence from an essay that is analyzing a passage from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And I don't think you need more than that to just look at what's happening in the sentence and how we can choose a better heart. So here is the original sentence. The Columbian Orator was a book that had a large impact on Douglass, giving him the realization and ability to express thoughts he had about his unsatisfaction. So the idea here is pretty clear. We understand what the writer is saying, but the sentence focus is off. If we imagine the sentence being filmed, the camera would be focused on the book, not on Douglass, which is the true subject of the sentence. So let's ask our sentence focus questions. Who or what should the protagonist of the sentence be? should be Douglas. What is Douglas doing? He's realizing and expressing. So the sentence core is probably something like Douglas understands and expresses. The part about the Columbian orator will become an introductory modifier. So take a moment to write that out, to play with that. Maybe pause the video and then restart it once you've got your own version. Here's my version. After reading the Columbian orator, Douglas can understand and express his dissatisfaction with slavery. In my opinion, it's much better. It's much clearer. The focus is on the person and what that person is doing. The book, Columbian Orator, is important, but it's really a cause-effect relationship. So instead of just telling us, here's a book that's important, it was important because it helped Douglas do this, we can take that idea about how it's important and make it an introductory modifier, the icing on the sentence. It helps us better understand why or how Douglas can understand and express his dissatisfaction. And the next step, do some practice on your own. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk together again soon.